with us for this important conversation, calling out xenophobia, racism, and intolerance during the COVID-19 crisis. And while we know that racism and bigotry is nothing new, particularly as it intersects with higher education, we should all be concerned about the levels of bias and intolerance, even as our institutions have shifted learning and operations from bricks and mortar campuses to virtual learning in the wake of COVID-19. Today, we have some of the nation's best thinkers to weigh in on this issue as we offer to you best practices and ways to advance equity and inclusion during these difficult and trying days. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Davis of the University of Southern California, who will begin a tenure-track faculty position at the University of Michigan this fall. Congratulations, Dr. Davis. We also have Dr. Leandra Paris of William & Mary and Dr. Vanessa Sansone of the University of Texas at San Antonio. Before we get started, I wanted to encourage you to submit your questions. We will have some time for Q&A, and we'll get to as many as possible. And I want to invite you to tweet about the session, tagging in diverse issues and using the hashtag COVID-19 racism. We're also planning to live stream this discussion on our Facebook page, diverse issues. Finally, we recognize that in an hour, we cannot simply cover everything. So I've asked our panelists to provide me some recommendations for additional readings related to this topic, and we will post their suggestions to our website and see if we can send them out to all attendees at a later date. So welcome. I want to start with Dr. Sansone and then go to Dr. Davis and then Dr. Paris, with asking you to help us to assess the climate level in the field of higher education in the wake of COVID-19.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. Thank you to Diverse for having us, as well as my fellow panelists for engaging in such a thoughtful discussion that there definitely is a need right now. I think when we think about the field of higher education in the wake of COVID-19, what really comes to mind is deciding about these organizational shifts that are going to happen, because the climate is one of instability. It's unstable right now. And I think even for professors and students, as well as staff, we've seen from day to day that, you know, from one day to the next, things were changing and still are in some cases. And so this idea of creating stability will also begin to help us think about how organizations can shift in terms of supporting equity, access, and diversity. One of the most important things that I find interesting in the wake of COVID-19 is how organizations are actually going to do that. What is the intentionality that they're going to have behind these shifts? So shifts online, shifts that were necessary for the health and well-being of faculty, staff, and students, but how are we going to make sure that we remain equitable in terms of access and diversity? Because not only do we see how some of these shifts are promoting equity, like I can think about some of the financial aid issues that have begun to shift, where we're supporting students more in the wake of this epidemic. But I think we also need to think about the ways that we're also creating unintentional ways of inequity in these shifts. But it's really promising to see how organizations are doing this. I think what leaves me with is that it can be done, which we've heard so many times that organizations, you know, this is the way that it's always been done. This is how higher education functions. But clearly this epidemic is pushing us to think more broadly and think more in terms of equity and success, not only for students, but staff and faculty.
Thank you, and we certainly want to get to some of those inequities a little later in our conversation, but I appreciate that. Dr. Davis.
So I think those are all excellent points by my colleague. I think one of the things that I'm turning my attention to is this notion of the external environment and sort of the context within which our colleges and universities are situated. And one thing that we know for sure, even emblematic from the election of Donald Trump, is how much the external environment can actually drive what's happening in the larger sort of context of how we understand campus climate. And so, you know, really the genesis of even this webinar today is as a result of what we've seen in terms of anti-Asian sentiment specifically as it relates to the thinking about the virus in and of itself. Donald Trump has repeatedly mentioned it and called it a Chinese virus. We've seen a number of violent attacks happen across the United States, especially in those areas that are highly populated by Southeast Asian folks in particular. And so for me, I'm thinking about this sort of like broader sense of climate and an externality sense of what that means, not just now, but also when folks come back to campus. The extent to which xenophobia will find itself again very much prominent and pressing for those particular students, and the ways that human interaction has been deeply affected by something like this pandemic. And so what does it mean for the types of ostracization that may take place, how we might view and think about our Asian American resource centers and things of that nature. And so I think there's something to be said for not underestimating how the environment within which our colleges and universities are situated may have a really deep and lasting impact based on anti-Asian xenophobia.
No, I appreciate that. Yes. Dr. Parrish.
Yeah, so I saw something today that I think captures this, where it's like you're not working from home, you're at home because of a pandemic and a crisis trying to work. And so I think that, as has already been pointed out, that creates a lot of instability, a lot of stress, a lot of feeling like we don't have control. And we know that when that happens, people start to get hostile and aggressive. And so it sort of increases the risk that racism and xenophobia is going to rear its head in these virtual online formats, because we're all scrambling. And I think at least my concern is, what are we missing in that scramble? And how do we respond to that effectively? And I think, as Dr. Davis pointed out, when we come back, there's a new normal that we're going to have to establish. And how do we make sure that we don't lose equity and we don't lose what we do here when we come back and establish this new environment that we're going to have to function in?
And that's not going to be easy to do. How do we disrupt the sort of racism that we know that is out there and existing? And Dr. Davis, you mentioned the racism, particularly against Asian and Asian Americans. What are some specific examples that we can give to those who are here about how to disrupt that kind of racism?
Sure. I mean, I think one sort of simple thing is to acknowledge the extent to which we ourselves may not be directly a member of that particular community, but how important it is for us to intervene in situations in which we see those that are vulnerable and more vulnerable perhaps than others, and stand in that gap, right? We need to be able to take up space and put ourselves, maybe sometimes even our very bodies, between those that wish to do harm and those that are experiencing harm. And so I think it's really important that we not just think of what it means to be sort of an ally in this particular moment, but also accomplices and dismantling the ways that interpersonal racism takes place. When we think about the racism that happens in classrooms, even, and the extent to which professors are either participatory or even complicit with comments that are made during lectures. We've seen, to some extent, the effects of Zoom bombing that have happened as well. I think all of those are opportunities for folks who are not a part of that specific community to step up and intervene and create some space between, the harm doers and the harm receivers. And I think that that's just really important, right? When we think about the broader umbrella under which white supremacy operates, that all of us are sort of fighting against the same very thing, right? And so this is a moment for us to strengthen our solidarity within and across racial groups. And so I think it's just really important that we don't leave Asian American members of our communities to have to fend for and deal with this by themselves. I think about that acutely at a place like USC and within California with our institutions, when we know sort of the demographics with which Asian Americans are a very prominent part of that, right? And so I think that this is an opportunity for us to forge together even stronger as a community to fight the rising tide of white supremacy on campus.
Thank you. Dr. Sansom.
No, I think Dr. Davis brings up an excellent point. Like, I can think about using these Zoom bombings as an opportunity to talk about these topics that typically we don't like to talk about. And it doesn't matter what field you're in, even if you're a professor of biology, professor of English, it's not, it should not be the call for one particular type of subject, to take on the task of discussing racism, xenophobia. It should be across institutions, across disciplines. And so really taking the time and opportunity to give students space to talk about how they feel is going to be key, I think, in the way that we should move forward, not only in terms of the online platform, but even when we go back into the classroom. I think this is really setting a tone for what institutions should be focusing on for the greater good of our population.
Dr. Parrish?
Yeah, so when I think about disrupting, at least as what we're doing right now in terms of the virtual world, I kind of think of like 4 different areas. So one is kind of recognizing your own bias. Like, you can't respond effectively if you don't recognize it. And I think aggression can be something blatant like racist comments, but it can also be microaggressions that can be just as disruptive to the learning process and to people's mental well-being. And so really making sure that you understand the context in which you're working and that you can recognize some of those more subtle forms like exclusion and cyberbullying. And then also being preventive and having those policies. One of the things that I did was I said, I recognize that Asian individuals are being targeted by racial and xenophobic remarks, and I want to make it clear that's not acceptable in my classroom. And if that happens, this is going to happen. And I basically said you'll be dismissed, but, insert whatever discipline that you think is appropriate. And then that way, when it does happen, I have something to fall back on. And I think making sure that we create that climate, like Dr. Senson said, that we can really build from and create that collaboration within the school environment, within our virtual classrooms. And I think responding consistently and making sure that every single time it happens, we respond the same way. I think we often focus on the power of the aggressor, not recognizing the power of everybody else who sees it. And so modeling that so other students are empowered to react is going to be really important.
The transition from bricks and mortar kind of campus to online happened so quickly. And in many ways, I think a lot of faculty members did not necessarily prepare for the levels of bigotry and discriminatory kind of comments and remarks that were going to be made online. What are some guidelines or ground rules now that we're in this new culture, in this new environment, that faculty have to kind of initiate in order to ensure that all folks remain safe and comfortable, even if it's in an online virtual classroom?
Yeah, I think Dr. Paris kind of set the tone for, part of these discussions, but it's really, the faculty themselves modeling this behavior, setting up your syllabi to address some of these concerns in case you think there might be pushback from students about what the expectations, even on an online platform, this is what will and will not be tolerated. Your syllabus can be one of those platforms for you to put within Word to refer back to when students do want to push back and say, I don't want to talk about race or any of these, issues that make me feel uncomfortable. Well, it's a part of the modeling that you're going to do in your classroom. I really think too, and I have to, bring this forward. This is going to be of utmost importance, particularly with regard to my white faculty colleagues, for them to do this. Like, the modeling behavior is going to be of key because, again, so much of this is expected from scholars of color and faculty of color, but it can't just be us. Demographically, we represent so few in the academy. And so we need white allies to help us with pushing this forward, particularly in the classrooms. And this also includes white administrators too, because it does, it has to be across institutional spaces, all spaces. Again, and that's my point of, like, it can't just be from, the liberal and fine arts or humanities area. It has to be across all spaces.
Yeah. Dr. Davis?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things about this that we could discuss. I want to just briefly shout out my former colleagues at the USC Race and Equity Center, namely Dr. Suman Pendiger and Jade Agua, who had an amazing webinar that talked about sort of what needs to be done on the front end as well as the back end. And so one of the things that we commonly talk about is this notion of building a container for the conversation that needs to happen in classrooms, right? Often these conversations sometimes happen by sort of happenstance, and we're not prepared. Right, the container itself actually isn't big enough to hold all of the things that are going on. And so part of what this may look like in an online forum is really setting up parameters for engagement in ways that can demonstrate a certain level of modeling and success, really thinking about the features that Zoom now has available for it to create more secure environments, right? And so there's a lot of these smaller things, like just making sure that it's password protected, having a co-host that can help monitor some of the discourse and chat that's happening, even remove participants if necessary, taking off shared screen features, some of the infrastructure things that could happen in a virtual setting that would limit the possibility of this taking place. And then of course it's, sort of what do you do in the moment? Right. And I think that's where we're finding that the gaps for faculty preparation to deal with racist incidents in classrooms are very, very high. And so I think more importantly, as Dr. Sansone mentioned, the faculty who don't deal with this every day in their course topics, right? They don't teach about these areas. We really need to find ways to engage and support them, and they have to be willing to engage with us to know that although you may be an expert in your particular area, that this is an area that is developing for a lot of folks that need to really increase their expertise, their practical skill sets, to know how to create interventions. And so even so much as, you know, having a conversation with your class, that if we are intercepted for some reason, here are the protocol that we're going to take to ensure that we can minimize the harm that takes place. And then here's a process and procedure that we will do to hopefully repair and restore folks who have been harmed as a result of that process once we've addressed that issue. And again, that's a skill set, and we want to think about that from a competency and proficiency lens. And so it should encourage institutions to think about using their centers for excellence in teaching and learning really to strengthen those skill sets and those competencies for folks who otherwise do not teach and are familiar with this area.
So institutions have to be proactive, really, and start now to really start preparing, because we don't know how long this will indeed last. And even if it doesn't last very long, it's still good best practices, right? Just good information.
Absolutely.
To have in order to.
It can't just be the technical dimensions of how to use Zoom, right? Yeah. It's sort of like the same as the technical dimensions of teaching about how do I put a lecture together. Yeah. It's like, okay, well, we can learn that, but you know, as Mike Tyson used to say, everybody's got a game plan until they get punched in the mouth, and that's what's happening in these Zoom bombing situations, right? We don't know how to be adaptable and to react when things happen because we don't have that deep sort of skill set and knowledge that we need so that people can be effective teachers in online platforms as well as in the classroom.
Right. And there are a lot of national resources that exist, as you point out, at USC and other places that can help institutions navigate this space, and that's important. Dr. Parrish.
No, I agree. I love Dr. Davis's point about the containment and sort of like how to put that in there. And then also one of the things I've tried to do is similar, having someone who can monitor some of the discourse in the breakout rooms with Zoom so that it's not, you know, just me trying to monitor everybody. And I think it's okay to say I reserve the right to mute you. I reserve the right to remove. If you violate the policy of my class, you are out of this discussion and you lose those points. And I think that just reminding at the beginning of every Zoom class of all of the policies that you have, not all of them, but you know, the ones that you really want to make sure are being used in that moment. But the biggest thing for me is avoiding power struggles. And I think that that's, you know, when someone's sort of talking and there's the lag in the Zoom and like you're trying to talk over them. And I think that's where those more assertive and active strategies will be important in terms of muting and removing them from the environment so that other students aren't continually having to be exposed to this.
Yeah. Let's talk, if we can, about the intersection between, I think, race and class, because I think often when we talk about race, there is this connection to class, and we ought to address that as well. And so since this whole pandemic started, I think it clearly, you know, underprivileged students have been, in many ways, I think, left out of the conversation, or they've been mentioned in a secondary kind of way. And Dr. Sansone, I know your work particularly focused on rural students is really important. I was wondering if you could talk about the connection and link between the race and class piece.
Yeah, I think a lot of times it's usually, you know, class typically gets to use as a way to overlook race and racism in the US, particularly when we think about poor white students. You know, we typically want to say like, well, how is that any different? You know, a poor Latinx student from a poor white student, or a student from a rural area from an urban area. And so there's a lot of putting students in boxes, you know, and we like to put them in boxes and say like, we're just this identity or that identity, but in reality, we're all multiple things. And so when we talk about this way of looking at the interplay of race and class, you began to see how systems and structures will really facilitate more inequity and in many cases oppression for a lot of our students. So in particular, my work in rural areas, it's been very interesting because I do look at students of color from rural areas in the field of higher education. And what's been most interesting is to see how, as Dr. Davis pointed out, these ways of like, where we didn't think about you know, these students beforehand, but we're really not thinking about them even as we get punched in the face and start to make these abrupt shifts to just, you know, stay as stable as we can in higher education. So specifically with the move to online, we've seen a lot of discussion on the K-12 front with how digital inequity is really demonstrating its and rearing its ugly head with regard to students living in these spaces. But we can't forget how this also is playing out for students in higher education. The thing about rural areas is a really good representation, though, of urban spaces too. When the whole epidemic started kind of coming down and the shift started happening, I was actually in Brooklyn, and the Wi-Fi access in the brownstones that I was staying in was shutting off and shutting on. And so as a faculty member, I was being asked to facilitate online classrooms, and I didn't have access to broadband. And so these were the things that I was thinking about. It's like, see, here we go. Like, I don't even know what to do. And this, I'm a faculty member. I can only imagine the stress that my students were feeling when they were being told to shift to online, and, issues about their health and all these other concerns that were just layering on. So it's been very interesting to see how inequity has been perpetuated by these shifts. And I think that's where my work will kind of demonstrate and hold a mirror to institutions to begin to think, well, don't forget about this, or there's an unintended consequence of X. Because hopefully when we do move back, we can still, have some good come from some of this with, like I mentioned in the beginning, with shifts in the policies with financial aid and things of that sort. But there are places where class and race, we're missing some of these discussions and points where we do need to address.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Davis?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all excellent, important points. I think a lot about the sort of presumption of ubiquity as it relates to internet access, and this notion that, we're just all digitally connected, especially this generation of college student. And that's just, not the case in a lot of rural areas that don't have access to high-speed internet. And even for those of us that have, the stressors that are put on now that everyone is at home in a crisis working, that's also putting pressure on the internet's ability to meet sort of the demand of what everybody needs to have at this time. But I think in terms of, the race class, dynamic, there's so many different aspects of this, right? And we're seeing not just in terms of the case of infections, but also in the case of deaths, how significant that's happening for particular communities. And when we think about who is constituted as an essential worker, right? Where are those families, and sort of what is the class ranking of those individuals, where if I'm a college student and maybe I'm the first person in my family to go to college, I'm the oldest of, multiple kids. We know that folks of color and Black folks in particular live in multi-generational households. If I come home from school, what is the perception or expectation for me to contribute in a different way as a family member that intercedes my ability to engage in sort of, what the school or the college provides, which is a space away from that, right? If my mother, and I'm in a single parent household, is an essential worker and she has to go to work and somebody needs to take care of the siblings because there is no daycare, right? How do we think about these different things? And I think one thing that's sort of popped up, I've been on some listservs, and perhaps my colleagues have as well, about what is the appropriate Zoom etiquette for students. And, a lot of folks have said, oh, well, all of my students aren't using their video, not necessarily thinking that maybe there's something in the background that I don't want to be publicly available to everyone, right? At a place like USC, when we think about the sort of class dynamics here, right? If I'm a first generation low income college student, I don't live in Beverly Hills perhaps, or some other part of the country where, I have the internet access, I have a background that's sort of appropriate, that doesn't reveal my class situation when I'm trying to navigate the class politics of my institution. And I think these are all things that we have to be much more aware of in how we think about instruction, how we think about our participation and engagement, when we're thinking about the implications for grading. These are all things that are really, really important and really challenge us to question the value of meritocracy in a different kind of way, but a really important way, right? And we have to say to ourselves as institutions, as faculty, as education leaders, to what extent are we willing to be continuously invested in these systems that overly stratify our society, stratify our student body, and ultimately may not matter when it comes to putting people above things like productivity, over profit, and of prestige.
And there's also the assumption, of course, that the students have phones or computers with cameras, all right? And that they're able to even access the classroom platform. So, often that's just the assumption, that's the given, but that's not always accurate, of course.
Yeah, Dr. Watson, if I can add one more thing from what Dr. Davis, I think it's has to be said that the inequities in terms of the community at large, U.S., have always been, it's been much harder for communities of color. And taking a step back from, higher education, access to healthcare, access to just a good K through 12 education. These are the things that are affecting communities of color already harder prior to this epidemic. So it's just another thing that they're gonna have to think about. Anybody who's from a community of color, a marginalized, historically marginalized community. So another thing for us to navigate, another thing for us to think about in terms of how we're reproducing inequity. That's the opportunity that I'm really hoping higher education will see and begin to create new incentives and policies to address, because it can't just be higher education sitting on top of the hill. You're gonna have to start looking at other components as an entire organism within the community and the structure, especially if your students are coming from these places, which they are.
Yeah, so I'm hearing that a rich engagement with the community becomes really important and really necessary in order to move forward. Dr. Parrish, did you want to add in?
No, I think those are all great points. I think a lot of the work that I've seen around like trauma and intergenerational trauma and historical trauma, now we're adding on another trauma on top of that. And so I think helping students manage some of that by providing resources that are available for them to access at will. I have a page that's like, here's all of the groups here on campus that you can meet with and reach out for help. And one of the things I keep thinking about just listening to everything that's been said is this actually sets up one of the reasons I have a really big problem with synchronous meetings, because we are then requiring students to meet at a certain time and requiring them to be available for a certain amount of time when that is not always logistical. So Dr. Davis brought up childcare. That's when they're supposed to be helping watching their siblings, and they're being punished for not being able to be at these synchronous events. And so I really would urge people to think about how you're requiring them to show up for these classroom synchronous events. And then also, how can you provide other opportunities that they can take at their own pace, say when they can get away or when the internet's not as crowded, depending on where they are and they have better bandwidth. And so I think that's the only thing that I would add is just how be careful about overuse of synchronous time.
No, that's a good point. One of the things I'm hearing a lot from faculty is that on college campuses, there is often this effort to push administrators to keep diversity, equity, and inclusion issues at the forefront. And that's always a constant battle, as we know. But the concern is that as the institutions move virtually, that some of the gains, some of the progress that has been made will not continue. And it'll almost be as if once we return back to our institutions, we're starting from ground zero again. Is that of any concern to any of you?
It's deeply concerning for me when I think about the sort of budgetary implications for diversity, equity, and inclusion work, right? One of the things that we know is that often those pools of money are contingent. They're discretionary, and so they can be repurposed as institutions see fit. And I think we're going to see a shift to some extent of monies that would otherwise be directed for DEI efforts to be things that are quote unquote pivoted to, COVID-19 responses without thinking about the diversity, equity, and inclusion implications of that particular moment. And so I think institutions have to be more thoughtful and even perhaps creative to really pivot the notion of DEI within the context of a pandemic, right? This is, for many folks who are working in higher education, the first time they've ever had to deal with something of this magnitude. And so I think it's important as we think about equity-mindedness as a frame, as Estella Ben-Simone's work points out, of what does it mean to apply that framework within this particular moment. As Dr. Parrish was talking about the role of like historical and intergenerational trauma, I'm thinking in particular maybe about our Native and Indigenous students. We have articles that have recently been reported that for Navajo Nation in particular, that their rates per capita are exceeding those of New York City. So what does it mean to have to respond to those particular needs of those students if and when they return to campus in places like Arizona, California, New Mexico, et cetera? And if you don't have that DEI frame in mind, then you think that this just applies to all students, right? And of course, all students have been affected to some extent, and we know that coronavirus doesn't discriminate, but we do know that policies and practices in higher education do. So what does it mean to then take that approach, take that lens, and think about if we're going to have a response from a pandemic standpoint, how do we ensure that diversity, equity, and inclusion aren't lost or pushed to the margins as they often have been when something else recenters?
Yeah, I'm also wondering, and I'll get to you all on the question as well, about some of our academic programs, more specifically ethnic studies, African American studies, women's studies, that always operate on the margins anyway. Whether or not some of those programs may in fact be cut down the road. So I'm wondering if that is also a concern.
That's
Yeah,
actually
absolutely.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Dr. Paris.
That's actually my thought was, I can think just, at least at my institution, there are these programs that have been developed by key faculty who may or may not be able to come back just because they're visiting professors, and now we have a hiring freeze. And so there are entire initiatives that we're just starting to get off the ground that now aren't going to have that leadership. And administration are going, at least in my experience, whenever there's anything else to prioritize, diversity and equity is the thing that gets cut. And so how do we, particularly as a white ally, how do we make sure that conversation keeps getting brought back up and we don't let that happen? And how do we advocate for those groups that are now student groups who don't have funding or aren't allowed to do their travel, or scholarships and fellowships that were specific to students of color who now aren't going to have any buyouts. So now I can't give you a stipend when you join my program. And so I think these are all things that administrators would say, oh, there's all these other things that are more important, but that's the structure of student well-being, and that we're providing successful opportunities and equitable educational opportunities. And so for me, I think it's just every time I have these meetings, I bring it back to how are we being equitable? How are we making sure everyone has access? And how are we going to set it up so that those who are affected the most get what they need once they get here? And so I think I feel that struggle because my hands are tied in some ways, but then making sure it is never missed out of the narrative.
Yeah, very good points. Dr. Senso?
No, I think it's just helpful to remind institutions in the thoughts for these contingency plans and these cuts that, as Dr. Paris pointed out, students are watching, right? Communities are watching, stakeholders are watching to see how institutions will react to this. And if we begin to see cuts to issues that affect students of color, women's studies, racial and ethnic studies programs, that does speak volumes to where the priorities lie, particularly in the wake of COVID-19. And so those institutions that do respond in equitable ways, they probably actually, they will, because students are hurting right now, and they want to know that they're going to go to institutions that care about them holistically. Because again, and I have a demography background, so that's why I tend to bring up demographics. Demographics are dictating, who those institutions are that we can, will begin to enroll. And again, it's going to be students from these that have always been at the margins, but that have these intersecting identities. An example that I'll provide, but our dreamer students, right? These students who are being left out of the conversation from the federal government. Institutions are not really sure how to respond, and honestly, they're probably hoping that they just go away. But these are students that matter, and these are the populations that that demographically, they're going to be the ones who, if you want to keep your enrollment up and have students fill seats, these are the populations that you're going to have to consider and be creative and intentional and thoughtful about in terms of how you respond.
Yeah, that's a good point. I have two more questions, and then I want to go to Q&A with the audience. The next question is, what are some of the ways individuals can help to create community online for marginalized students?
So I mentioned earlier, one of the things that I've tried to offer is that, as a white faculty member, I'm not always the one that they may be most comfortable reaching out to. And I let them know on the onset that that's fine. And these are some other areas. And so we have on campus students of color, graduate student of color, organizations that are very active right now. They have Zoom meetings. I make sure that those links are available. Anything that our national organization is sharing in terms of mentorship and availability for those communities to meet, I'm just putting out on the subpage of my online course so that it's always available and accessible. And I think that just having the conversations before you have to, so preventatively making sure that it's part of the discourse of your course and making sure that you're tying it into the content. I'm very lucky that I'm teaching crisis intervention right now. So this is very easy for me to tie in, but I think any way that you can sort of acknowledge the current state of what's going on will help build community, because you're just acknowledging the space that we're all in right now. And so I think that's, providing those resources and letting them know where they can get things beyond just you.
Dr. Senso?
So one of the things that I have tried to do in terms of creating community is, again, tying into the lecture, the what's going on into the curriculum, But again, it's giving students space, as Dr. Paris said, to talk about it, but also understand that we're all in it too. I think sometimes, particularly when we think about hierarchies of power, that faculty are, are invincible to all this, and that's not necessarily the case. I'm struggling just as much as my students are struggling with the day-to-day aspects and the change, and all the stressors and pullers, that are taking me different ways. If I'm going through that, I know my students are going through that, and I think there's solidarity that can happen there. And when you begin to address those things and bring those things forward, I think you create a community and a foundation, a solid foundation to move forward, because you build trust there. So that's opportunities that I've created to bring in conversations of what's going on in the current pandemic era. And you can pull from any place. So again, I want to make sure that it's not discipline specific. It can be anything, to create these opportunities for students to build trustful relationships that will create community.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Davis.
Yeah, I really just want to underscore, I think, the points that have been made, and particularly Dr. Sanson's point of, the extent to which faculty can share a space of vulnerability. I think that's really, really important to both humanize sort of who we are in this space, but to really, do what we would say is being in right relationship with the process of teaching and learning. We often ask so much of our students to give of themselves and to share their stories, but how often are we willing to share with them sort of the ways in which we are struggling in and of ourselves? And at least in my experience, that's been really, really useful to actually achieving some of the learning outcomes that are, associated with the course traditionally, simply by having a better relationship with those students. And so, in my particular case, this is something that I open up every class session with, sort of an undefined amount of time where we can discuss what's been happening in the world generally, and particularly what's going on with COVID-19, and even my own struggles of having to navigate that as somebody partnered in with a new child that's just come into the world, and my own concerns about the immunocompromisation of infants at this point, and having to be the person that goes out every couple of weeks to get food and supplies that we may need, and my own concerns of just not knowing whether I could pick up something, possibly bring it back to my partner and to our child, and that for me was something I felt like I needed to share, in part because my students have been excellent in supporting me through sort of this process while sort of partially being on leave and teaching, but letting them know that they're not going through this alone. And, lo and behold, many of them are experiencing these things with relatives or with in-laws or with other people. And I think knowing that we can recognize the humanity in each other, I think is sort of the first point of us being able to do our work effectively in any type of way at this particular moment, because we have to go right where we don't think we want to, right? This is a barrier to entry, whether we address it or not. And so I think it behooves us to sort of get in there, get dirty, and do the work of just being in right relationship with one another so that we can move forward together as a collective.
I think that's a good point. I'm thinking about the news that over the last couple of weeks of colleges and universities deciding to stop the tenure track clock, or to allow individuals to have a little bit more time, obviously, given this whole situation. And I'm curious, you all are assistant professors, and I'm wondering, is there discussion among colleagues about what that means? Is there also an expectation that you will continue to do the scholarly work that you did prior to this all happening? I mean, how has this kind of reshaped and changed the ways in which you approach your scholarly work? I'm just curious.
I think a lot of institutions have decided on that. Some of them have not. So again, it's not standard across the board for institutions what they've decided. I can tell you, my own institution, that's not something that they're standardizing for everybody. Whereas other institutions, they've done it for all tenure track faculty. That doesn't mean that they're not, they wouldn't consider that for us, but again, different approaches that every institution's taking. So it's kind of hard to talk about this in a generalized kind of way, because again, what's happening in my institution may differ from what's happening at Dr. Davis's and Dr. Paris's. But as a tenure track faculty, my biggest concern is going to be my emotional health and well-being. And so the idea of productivity right now, I think, we've all been socialized into the academy to be productive and to be these workhorses, but it's really, the COVID-19, I think, is really giving us pause to consider what is and is of utmost importance. What does that mean in terms of our tenure status? I'm really hoping that administration begins to be empathetic to those situations and begin to shift their ideas of what productivity is. To be quite honest, in terms of the coins of the academy, where journals and manuscript submissions are usually top, there's already concerns from journals about the uptick in submissions and the downtick of reviewers. And so, what do you do even if you are productive and constantly submitting? They're still going to be in queue, and yet the clock still keeps ticking. So those are things that I think, as tenure track faculty, I really need to rely on my senior scholars who are tenured and who are members in the field, to include organizations like AAUW, the American Association for, American Association for University Professors, AAP. Those organizations to really begin to fight for us who are untenured, or at least advocate for us in ways, because there is a power dynamic and a shift that I only have so much power in addressing.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, one of the things that our university is doing is we're actually getting feedback from faculty, like, how do you want this to go? Do you want a choice? Do you just want us to not, maybe we don't count student evaluations because we expect that they're going to go down with everything. And they haven't actually come out and said exactly what they're going to do. But I think the idea of letting people decide, do I stop my clock and do I not? My concern is if you do stop your clock, what if you have pre-tenure funds that are associated with that? Does it go away? Do you lose it? And I have colleagues right now that are scrambling to spend the remainder of their pre-tenure funds because that was, allocated for research. But if you're doing K through 12 research and you're in the schools, you don't have participants anymore. And so how are, institutions kind of earmarking funds for pre-tenure faculty that don't have anywhere to spend it right now, but supposedly need to finish it by July? So I think that that's the things that we're kind of seeing is just people how to navigate those systematic structures that already put us lower on the power structure. And I think your point about senior faculty really advocating for you is important. They're the ones on the evaluation committee. They're the ones who are voting on these policies about what's included and what's not. And I'll just say, shout out to my colleagues at William & Mary. We had a social hour and they said, I'm here for you. We're going to advocate for you. And I think that is probably one of the greatest things that I've had since this whole thing started. So I do think it's on our mind, but we're also trying to put out our own fires. Like you said, mental well-being is going to be coming first.
Dr. Davis, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I come at it from a, sort of unique position. I'm at, I spent the last 6 years in non-tenure track roles. I'll start my first year on the tenure track in the fall. And so I'm actually thinking about what it means for those that are starting and will soon be in the tenure stream for how we even think about productivity moving forward, right? This notion that we will return to some sense of normalcy, I think is a bit overstated, and we don't know what the new normal is going to be. And so what does that mean for the way that we evaluate promotion and tenure cases where everyone is quote unquote less productive? Do we shift our model from, one of quantity to one of quality in terms of a better balance? Many of us know scholars of color in particular who have gotten tenure with, twice, 3 times the amount of publications as their white counterparts. And so that has sometimes become the new standard by which we are all judged. And is that even reasonable moving forward, given the infrastructure challenges and also the mental health and emotional health needs of folks trying to focus, and refocus their efforts on relationships with people in their proximity. And so I'm thinking about that a lot of what it means for new tenure track faculty coming into the fall. And I'm also thinking about, the many PhD students who are concerned about the job market, which has always been sort of precarious, but for a place that's already been really difficult for folks to get into, myself included, what does it mean for how few or fewer tenure track positions there will be in the fall? And following falls after that for students, despite their productivity, despite all of the things that they've been able to do to put themselves in positions to win, will there be opportunities? And that we don't know, as many institutions are having to, tighten their, finances a bit. And even some places have withdrawn and rescinded offers. Some people have just frozen hiring. In particular, we talked about the implications for ethnic studies. I think at Harvard, there's an entire department that just isn't probably going to happen anymore as a result. And this is, Harvard, biggest endowment in the world. So I think there are a lot of questions that still need to be answered. But I don't know that we have all of the information yet to do that, to make an informed decision.
Now let's go to an audience question. How do we talk about free speech during this time? Many faculty who are relying on the policies they place in their online classrooms, but free speech can be a hard space to navigate. Can you provide any tips?
So I think, go ahead, Dr. Davis. No, Dr. Davis, go ahead.
So some of my work has started to broach that particular topic. For me, the thing about free speech is that I think the legal framework is always limiting, right? And one of the things that we know from critical race theory work that emerged out of critical legal studies is that the law in and of itself is not neutral, right? It's not a tool to which we all have access. And so when we go to the conversation about free speech and the First Amendment, for me, when I think about the nature of post-secondary institutions as social institutions, we have to be considering the social impact of the things that we're allowing to take place and happen. And a lot of the conversation about hate speech and discourse in that regard is not thinking about the social impact. It's saying, well, because you have a quote unquote right to say the things you need to say, you also have the right to be free from consequence, right? Or free from any level of regulation that otherwise would deeply impact and affect the climate on our campus. And we see many speakers, both who are currently on campus, and this is sort of one of the things about the Zoom bombing for me, is that we always think it's some sort of outside threat. But to me, for someone to get a listing of the class, to get the ID number to come into the Zoom, tells me that there are more white supremacists that have access on campus than there are those people who are coming off campus, right? And so I think we have to have a conversation about the social impact or the social detriment of operating in this sort of laissez-faire approach to the First Amendment and free speech that moves us away from thinking about it just as a legal concept to really think about the social impact that ends up happening when we allow certain things to persist under the guise of freedom of speech.
Anyone else want to type that one?
No, I think it's really important to begin to interrogate our own pedagogy approaches, like as faculty. A lot of us, for many of us, we're subject matter experts in our field, but in our training and apprenticeship, in our doctoral studies, most of us were not trained to teach. And so we really need to begin to focus on what does it mean in terms of our pedagogical approaches. Coming from my own personal approaches, I really do research and read from pedagogical experts, but that are coming from social justice perspectives, like, and we're going to give you some resources, but, Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Press, Bettina Love, Bell Hooks, Pedagogies of Love. And so it's really began to shape the way that I teach. And so when we have these conversations about free speech, and if forms of hate speech do come out in your classroom, my take on that is that you have, it is our constitutional right for free speech, but that doesn't take away from having critical thought and critical consciousness in why do you believe and where does that come from? So you can say it, but if you're going to say this stuff in my classroom, you better also come with some reasoning and justification for why that is the case of your discourse and why you believe that. I tend to take these opportunities to still be teachable moments for my students, as well as particularly for the student who wants to say something like that. I can't not let that happen. Again, free speech is there, but how do we change those into teachable moments for all of us to learn from?
Yeah, very good. Next question is, how do you persuade senior administrators who think that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a distraction from focusing on the COVID-19 crisis that is really important, especially at this time? We touched on it a little bit, but are there any specific suggestions you might have for this?
I mean, I don't think, persuade is kind of the word I think that makes me shift around, the idea of having to persuade when you're a higher education institution bothers me, because we were all created on the foundation of higher education being a public good. When you start to begin to ignore, issues of equity, diversity, now I have to question who you are, right? And again, there's no problem with an institution saying that, guess what, all of our students come from affluent white backgrounds, but then don't tell me that you're an institution for equity and diversity. Like that's not your identity. You are who you are. And so, the idea that we have to persuade administration is bothersome. And again, it goes with the identity of the institution and organization of who you are.
Anyone else want to jump in on that one?
I was just going to agree that this is a good place for allyship to come in and really be like, I try to take on, I'm always asking at the end of every conversation, what are the systems that are playing into this decision? where are the inequities, like taking on that for myself and just I'm the person in the room who's constantly bringing it up every time. And so I think this is a good time for white faculty to really step up and provide some allyship when you're in the room.
Yeah. Here's a question. What are some examples of institutional policies and practices that could be adapted well during these times, particularly to avoid marginalization and discrimination? Dr. Davis?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things that we're seeing sort of initially are things around admissions, right? And so we've seen a lot of institutions say we're no longer going to, require the SAT or the ACT as a precondition for, admissions to our institution. And while that seems like, oh, that's great, it's appropriate for this particular time, it also raises this broader question of, why those things are weighed so heavily in admissions processes anyway, given what we know about the not only cultural bias, but the sort of disproportionate impact of the SAT and ACT on students of color, right? And so we have to answer a deeper question of why we're so committed and invested in a thing that actually is helping stratify us further and producing greater inequities. We also have to think about, the various affirmative action rollbacks, especially in this particular time, and the extent to which those have had deep effects on who's able to access, our considered quote unquote elite institutions. And so I think around admissions, these are things that we need to think about of the deeper impacts of what COVID-19 has done. And then what limitations, again, it places on the things that we say that we used to value that perhaps aren't as important as they used to be. And I think that's a critical question that admissions officers and other senior academic officers are really going to need to assess as we move forward, especially when we're thinking about the dip in enrollments, possibly that may be the result of folks not wanting to pay, top dollar for, what will otherwise end up being an online education, those who don't have resources to return to campus after this has happened. When we think about the, expected family commitment towards people's, education, that for many folks with the 16 million folks who have filed for unemployment, EFCs of zero are going to go, kind of through the roof, right? So then what are the financial packages that are appropriate? Will we see a less of a ballooning of tuition and cost sharing amongst students? So I think admissions and financial aid are probably the two areas that we've seen, the most sort of head-on direction for this, but we have to have an honest conversation about why we continue to do the things as usual when we could actually radically reimagine a different university.
Reimagine, I like that. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I think that also plays weight in terms of policy, right? So thinking of those strategies of what can we do, this is a great time to think about and reimagine accountability measures that higher education has always had to deal with, because a lot of these abrupt shifts and changes throughout the course have really related to funding issues. So really thinking and starting to address what success means in your particular institution. And, I want to give, I want to think about this in broader beyond institutions that are research intensive institutions. I'm talking about community colleges. I'm talking about regional serving institutions. I'm talking about those institutions that are teaching intensive. So really thinking about what success means and how you're creating success, because it's also going to involve discussions with policymakers about how your students are and are not successful, as well as accrediting agencies too. This is going to be that time to reimagine how you're serving and what you're doing, and the accountability that you should be receiving.
Yeah. Maybe one last question. This one says, thinking about how we move forward. This is the re-entry question. Not with best practices, but with next practices, as this new normal will require us to do our work differently. What are some specific recommendations you would have for faculty and staff to take, especially when students begin returning back to our campuses? Dr. Parrish?
So I immediately was thinking that this will not be over for everybody when they come back. This is going to be something that's long lasting. And I think we have to give that space, like we've already mentioned, for assessing where they are, what their needs are, what their capacity is. I don't think this is going to be over in the fall for so many of our students. And so how can we sort of deconstruct the systems that we're working in to make it more equitable, make it easier, reduce that, that demand and that capacity to try to make it a safe space for them. And I think some people will think, well, like, I'm already doing that, but doing it intentionally is a different thing. And doing it intentional in light of, you may not always be aware of exactly where your students are when they come into the room. And so for me, coming back is going to be a lot of what is this new normal, talking to the students, getting their reactions, and adjusting accordingly, and making sure that I'm providing as many opportunities as we can to really have that conversation and keep it going, and that it's not one of those, oh, we're back, we're not going to talk about this anymore, it's over, right?
Yeah. Dr. Sisko?
No, I think, you know, and I also think about doing the intentionality and having these discussions, even in large classroom settings, right? Like the 300 introductory courses, you know, lecture halls. It's gonna, you know, and I really like Dr. Davis's word of reimagining, right? You know, ASH, the Associate University of Higher Education, annual conference was focused on this idea of reimagining higher education. And so I think that word has stuck with me in this COVID era, but in reimagining how to do that kind of intentionality in ways that we've never had to do before. You know, I don't know if things can go back the same, like you know, a 300 person classroom like that. You know, we're going to have to think of new ways to address these things, and the strategies, it's difficult to have them right out the gate, because like we've said throughout this whole webcast, that we're still shifting and changing every day, the way that higher education. So it's really hard to begin to create a plan when nothing is stable right now. But I think sitting in that and leaning into that uncomfortableness of the instability, I do believe that we can come up with certain ways and strategies to reimagine it. But as far as, you know, what that will look like specifically at each institution, I'm not quite sure. And I'm, you know, focusing on just my own classroom to see what I can do in the power structures that I have with my own students.
Well said. Dr. Davis?
I think, yeah, all great points. I think, you know, two main things are sticking out to me, and particularly thinking about Dr. Paris's work, the extent to which faculty are ill-prepared to deal with sort of the socio-emotional aspects of what their students are going through and dealing with. You know, someone who's, you know, has a student affairs background and works in higher ed as a field of study, these are things for which I was prepared and trained, as well as being, you know, an organizer, but a lot of folks don't have that skill, right? And so I think even, you know, just base level, when we think about beyond, or actually in addition to addressing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, what about socio-emotional health, and how do we create space for students to have, you know, less perhaps you know, a stressor when it comes to the expectations of what their assignments will even look like, or the extent to which they need to be, you know, turned in a timely fashion, given that, you know, for many of our institutions that are no longer, you know, regional, but actually national in scope, you know, if I've got a student who's from New Orleans that comes to USC, and I know what New Orleans is going through, I have to expect that that student probably has some things still going on at home that I need to be, you know, sort of accounting for and answerable to. And so I think that's going to be really important of how we think about the socio-emotional environments that we construct in our classrooms. I think in addition to that, we have to be open to, you know, a new approach to assessment, right? And really thinking about assessment in a way that isn't about rank ordering students, you know, in terms of GPA, but really assessing, you know, our effectiveness as instructors of whether we are allowing students space to learn what they need to, and we can measure those according to our learning objectives. And that's what we're seeing a bit when we've shifted for some institutions to a pass-fail structure, right, just for the semester, but we have to extend even further beyond that. And I know that there are broader implications that we have to consider, you know, with certain jobs and how they rank folks for admissions into graduate school and things of that nature. But again, what is really important in this moment, and for me, it's people. And so when we talk about possibly reopening institutions, when we talk about moving forward, we have to constantly place people, again, over profit, over productivity, over prestige, and make sure that the survival of people is more important than the survival of our institution.
Well said, and that's certainly a great place to end this conversation. Certainly want to thank all of you for engaging in conversation. I learned a lot, quite frankly, and I'm sure all of you did as well. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Wendy.
Great, thank you so much. And we do hope you join us for our next webcast. Here's the information there. It's next Wednesday. And again, thank you so much for joining today. It was a great discussion, and we hope to see you on a future webcast. Once the Zoom room closes, you will see a survey pop up, so please complete that for us. We'd love to get your feedback on this webcast and ideas for future webcasts. So again, thank you so much for joining, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.